Movie Recaps presents A Nightmare on Elm Street. The movie opens with a frightening sequence where an unidentified figure's hands are constructing a glove with knives for fingers. We see Tina, a young woman dressed in a nightgown. She runs down the wet floors of a dark boiler room. Suddenly, a figure lunges at her. She screams and sits up in her bed, realizing that she was in a nightmare. Tina's mother opens her bedroom door. As she looks at Tina, she sees that her nightgown has 4 slash marks near her stomach. Tina wakes up the next morning and goes to school. She meets up with her boyfriend Rod, Nancy, her best friend, and Glenn, Nancy's boyfriend. While talking, Tina and Nancy realize that they have both had nightmares about the same creepy guy. Although Rod and Glenn have as well, they try to hide it. That night, Nancy brings over Glenn so they can both stay with Tina while her mother is out of town. They all hear some odd scraping noises from outside and find out that it's just Rod. Tina and Rod decide to go upstairs for some sex, while Nancy and Glenn are downstairs sleeping separately, much to the dismay of Glenn. They all drift off to sleep, and a figure pushes through the wall of Nancy's bedroom, but retreats when Nancy wakes up. In Tina and Rod's room, Tina wakes up because of rocks being thrown at the window. Feeling that this may be the creepy man that has been scaring her, she leaves the house and wanders into an alley. Suddenly, the maniacal figure lurches towards her. He wears a red and green sweater with a battered fedora and the finger knife glove on his right hand. As he taunts her and laughs, his arms stretch outward, covering the length of the alleyway, blocking any escape. Tina runs back to the house, but the figure manages to grab her, and they grapple. Suddenly, we see Tina under the sheets of the bed she's sleeping in, fighting with the man. Rod wakes up and tears the sheet off of them, but he can only see Tina thrashing about. Suddenly, 4 razor cuts slash across her stomach. Tina is forced up the wall bleeding and then crashes to the bed, dead. Glenn and Nancy burst into the room and see Tina dead and Rod missing. Nancy goes to the police station and answers questions with her mother. Her father, who is a policeman, enters, and we can see that there is tension between her divorced parents. Rod has been singled out as the main suspect in Tina's murder, but Nancy insists that Rod would never do such a thing. The next morning, Nancy decides to go to school. Along the way, Rod jumps out and takes her into the bushes. Rod says that he had nothing to do with Tina's death. Nancy's father appears as Rod bolts. As he's running off, he gets arrested. Nancy realizes that her father used her as bait to draw Rod out. At school, Nancy becomes exhausted and can fight sleep no longer. As she drifts off in class, she looks up and sees Tina in a bloody body bag calling her name. Nancy tries to follow her as Tina is dragged away by an invisible force. Nancy follows the grisly scene down into the school's boiler room. Once there, she is accosted by the creepy figure, seeing that his head and face are brutally burned. He moves towards Nancy until her back is against the wall, but before he can slash her, she presses her arm against a hot pipe, which wakes her up, screaming. She wakes up still in class, thrashing about, and the teacher calms her down. As she does calm down, she leaves school. It is then that she notices that there is a real burn on her arm. Nancy visits Rod in jail, and he admits that he has had nightmares about the same guy. She tells him that she knows that he didn't kill Tina, and she leaves. At home, Nancy is resting in the tub and manages to drift into sleep. As she does, an arm wearing the knife glove peeks through the water between Nancy's legs, but retreats when Nancy's mother knocks on the door, checking on her. Nancy goes back to her bath, but is grabbed and pulled through her bathtub into a hole leading to a dark ocean. She manages to escape his clutches and return to the waking world, screaming. Her mother bursts into the bathroom to help Nancy, but Nancy assures her that she is all right and that she had just slipped. Nancy gets Glenn to help her with an experiment. She tells him to follow her as she takes a dream walk. Nancy reaches the jail that Rod has been put in and looks at him by peering through the barred window. As Rod sleeps, Nancy sees the killer walk through the bars of the jail and loom over Rod. Nancy calls for Glenn, but he doesn't answer. Instead, the killer says, "I'm here," as he appears and chases her back to the house. Nancy runs inside and up the stairs, but her feet fall into sticky holes in the stairs. The killer smashes through the window in the front. Nancy wakes up from her nightmare in her bed and yells at Glenn for falling asleep and not watching over her as she slept and waking her up. Nancy takes Glenn and they run over to the jail cell to check on Rod. They get stuck having to explain why they're there, and in Rod's cell, we see the bed sheet begin wrapping around his neck and pulling him upward to a bar near the ceiling, breaking his neck. Lieutenant Thompson, her father, doesn't believe that they are being haunted by someone in their dreams and says that Rod hung himself. Both Marge and Lieutenant Thompson exchange looks showing their recognition of Nancy's claims, but they do not say anything. Marge takes Nancy to a clinic, and they hook her up to sleep monitoring equipment. Once she is within the nightmare, the machines go crazy, and they run in to wake her up. Nancy thrashes awake and now has a streak of gray hair, as well as a fedora she pulled off the killer in her nightmare. Once home, Marge insists that Nancy sleep, but Nancy confronts her mother about the name, Fred Krueger, that is in the hat. Marge continues to say that nothing strange is happening and that Nancy needs to sleep. Nancy meets with Glenn the next day, and he tells her about Zen masters who can control their dreams and take away a nightmare's energy. Glenn is worried that Nancy thinks she can die in a nightmare and sees that she is reading a book on making traps. When Nancy gets home, she sees bars on the window, and her mother decides to tell Nancy what she knows. In the basement, Marge tells Nancy that Freddy Krueger was a child killer who got away with it because of a technicality. She says that some of the parents in the neighborhood got together, trapped Freddy in a boiler room, and set the place on fire. Marge reaches into their furnace and takes out Freddy's glove. Nancy realizes now that Freddy is killing the children of those parents in their nightmares. Nancy tries to call Glenn in order to warn him, but his parents take the phone off the hook. She gets a call from Freddy, taunting her, and in her anger, she tears the phone out of the wall. Dismayed, she wraps up the phone and tosses it on her bed. As she turns away, the phone rings, and she answers it. Freddy scares her again, and she smashes the phone. Glenn falls asleep across the street, and Freddy drags him into his bed, killing him and sending a font of blood up to the ceiling. Nancy calls her father and tells him to come over to the house in 20 minutes and break down the door so he can arrest Freddy when she captures him. Her father says he will, but tells her to get some sleep, showing that he doesn't really believe her. Nancy prepares by making a few booby traps to give her an edge when battling Freddy. She says goodnight to her mother, goes to her room, sets her alarm, and ventures into the dream world. Nancy finds herself walking into her basement where she finds another door that leads her down into Freddy's boiler room. She searches around, but Freddy is nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, he attacks her, and they grapple. The dreamscape changes to the front of her house. She sees Freddy and lunges directly at him. Her alarm blares, and she wakes up in bed, struggling. But Freddy is not there. She is upset that she has failed, but Freddy jumps up and attacks. Nancy manages to get out of her room and taunt Freddy. Freddy gets the door open, but it is hit with a sledgehammer, as well as having a light bulb detonate by his head. Nancy uses this time to scream to the cop standing outside of Glenn's house and tells him to get her father. Nancy lures Freddy into the basement where she sets him on fire. As Nancy escapes, her father breaks in the door. It is then that they all notice fiery footsteps leading up to her mother's room. They enter the room and see Freddy on fire attacking her mother in bed. Nancy's father throws a blanket over them, and when he pulls it off, they all see nothing but her mother's charred body sinking into the bed, and then it vanishes. Everyone is shocked, but Nancy realizes what she has to do and has her father leave the room. Freddy rises up from the bed and cuts his way out. Freddy threatens her, but Nancy doesn't show fear. She just turns her back on him. And remembering what Glenn said about Zen masters, Nancy says that she takes away all the energy that she ever gave him, and that he is nothing. Angrily, Freddy lunges at her, but instantly vanishes away. Nancy opens her bedroom door, which leads to the outside of the house in bright daylight. Nancy is dressed for school, and her mother is with her, sober and happy. Tina, Rod, and Glenn drive up in a convertible. Nancy gets into the car, and when the top is put down, we see that it is red and green striped. Suddenly, the doors lock, and the car drives away by itself. Marge stands waving at them as they drive off. The front door window shatters, and Freddy grabs her and violently drags her through the window. And with that, the movie ends.